This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. Today, I'm very honored to feature Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, bioethicist, psychiatrist, and one of the great dissidents of the COVID period, who turned out to have been a major plaintiff in a very important piece of litigation for free speech. Author of The New Abnormal, came out in 2022. I think it might actually qualify as one of the classics of our age because he saw everything. He saw the biosecurity state coming at us. It wasn't just about public health. He saw that it was about data collection and imposition of an Orwellian security state that reached into our bodies and our biology at the most fundamental level. And in that sense, this book from 2022 was telling us things that we didn't want to face, that we thought, well, maybe they just made a big mistake here concerning infectious disease. But he saw there's a lot more going on, even at that time. So it's kind of remarkable this book came out when it did. Since then, he has written a major book about the practice of medicine itself, and it's a memoir he wrote of his years in medical school called "Making the Cut," and it's a criticism of the direction that medicine has gone. Today, I should also add that Aaron Kheriaty is also a senior counselor for Brownstone Institute. Very pleased to work with him now. All these years, I guess like 5 years now, we've been working together. The dissidents at the time were a small group, and we got to know each other pretty well. Very thrilled to work with Aaron Kheriaty and introduce him now. It's great to see you, Aaron.
Always good to be with you, Jeffrey. Thank you. That was a very generous introduction. If I could, I thank you for mentioning The New Abnormal, because it's not my most recent book, but it may be still the most relevant. People think it was a book about COVID, but I always try to explain to people it's not a retrospective primarily. It's a book about the future. And one of the things that's been on the Brownstone agenda recently, I noticed, was you all have been talking about these proposals for climate lockdowns to deal with, the climate crisis, energy problems, what have you. And I actually discussed that in The New Abnormal a little bit back in 2022. There are already people a month or two into COVID lockdowns talking in, little dark corners on the internet, but still talking about serious proposals to use this for other purposes, such as energy and climate. And so I mentioned that in the book, and we hadn't seen much of it in the last few years, but now apparently that proposal is resurfacing. So I take no pleasure in saying I told you so, but but it was supposed to be a book about the future, and we seem to be starting to live in that future that it worried about.
That's the thing. We all wanted it to be over, and even now people say to me all the time, why do you keep talking about COVID? It's a 6-year-old flu. But when we use the word COVID, we're not just talking about a 6-year-old flu. We're talking about an entire hegemon of control over the population. And and in a sense, there's a funny way in which, a lot of that, the episode is gone, but the machinery is still with us.
Exactly.
And we wanted it to end. I certainly did. And we've done our best, but we look all around us and it seems to be advancing at a greater rate than ever before. In particular, the advances in AI we seem to be more and more surrounded by data extractors, and following up with a kind of life controllers and their machines, and they're designed in a sense for social control, and COVID turned out to be a major sort of test case of that.
Exactly.
Let me ask you something, because I was a little bit spooked by this. Those were weird years. I didn't know what was happening. It was all just so crazy. At first I thought it was just a giant error that would go away in 2 weeks, but it didn't go away in 2 weeks. It lasted another 8 months, and then another year, and then another year. And then finally that sort of died down, and there was never a point at which anybody said, all right, that was over, much less that was dumb, much less we're sorry. But rather, it was like just the theme changed suddenly. And then just one day, this would have been like 2 years ago, it's like, oh, here's your great new toy. It's called artificial intelligence. Go play with it. And we were all amazed, and the entire subject changed. Do you ever wonder about the timing of that? It seems sometimes when you look at these narratives that we're all just kind of part of a larger hegemony that that none of us is really in charge of, or maybe nobody in particular is in charge of it. It just seems to be happening and happening.
I think it's a very intriguing question. My initial thought is that AI actually represents the next iteration in the machinery, or the tool that will be used in the next iteration of the machinery that was put together in COVID for purposes of surveillance and control and intrusion on the private lives and even thoughts of citizens, the censorship, the propaganda, the data extraction, the controlling of movements, down to the fine-grained level of how far apart from another person do I need to stand, right?
Right.
So thought control, bodily control at the level of injecting people on pain of severe punishments with products that they may or may not want. Why do I say that the next iteration of the 2.0 version of that? Well, in COVID, if you didn't like any of those policies, you could at least plausibly point it. Even it was hard to find the people that were responsible, but you could still point a finger and say, well, okay, this is an executive order from a governor. So at some level, the governor of our state is responsible for this policy. This is an executive order from the president, or an emergency declaration from the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And therefore, there is a locus of responsibility. Our case, Missouri v. Biden, challenging government censorship, named individual entities within the government, individual people and agencies, right? There were people that you could drag before the bar, drag before a court of justice and accuse them of something, in this case, breaking the law, violating the Constitution, and so forth.
It seemed like there was decision makers, and of course we had Fauci stepping forward.
Yeah, and it was hard to tell who the decision makers always were. Granted, right. But you knew they were there, right? There were actually people enacting these policies and enforcing these policies. Whereas one of the major ethical challenges with AI is the question of who is responsible, the moral agency. So, you had this case that made the news of a young man interacting with one of the large language models. I forget which one it was. I don't want to accuse ChatGPT or whoever it was of something that wasn't theirs. But anyway, I think it was ChatGPT. This adolescent kid who was going back and forth talking about suicide. And if you go back and look at the thread of the conversation he was having with this chatbot, he actually started expressing doubts about maybe I shouldn't kill myself. And the chatbot pushed him in the direction of suicide. He ended up taking his own life. And then the parents sued the company that hosted this large language model chatbot. But there's a very real question.
To no effect, right? I mean, this is one of the weird things.
Well, who's responsible, right? Is it the programmers that are responsible? The programmers who designed these systems are telling us these systems are behaving in ways that we did not anticipate and we did not predict. And we don't know why they're doing what they're doing, right? It's almost as though they have an agency of their own, but not the kind of agency that you can hold them responsible for. So is it the CEO of the company that's responsible? Who is responsible? So let's just take the issue.
They came with an automatic indemnification against all liability for anything and everything. And I realized this early on because I was using Grok, I guess, and there was early on in the naive days, and I asked a question and Grok answered very definitively the following thing. Oh, it was concerning the biography of somebody. Oh, he got his education here, he got his education there. Well, I didn't know at that time to be incredulous, so I just said, oh, look, this guy was educated here and educated there. And then about a day later, somebody said, well, I don't know where you got that. That's completely wrong. And I was mortified. And I went back and asked Grok, and Grok said, oh, yeah, that's wrong. Here's the right thing. And and it was at that moment I realized, oh, this machine bears no responsibility whatsoever for anything. There's no compensation. There's no, it gives you a very flattering apology. You're right, I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm. Very often tells you what it thinks you want to hear. It feels that way. We keep talking about this thing as though it's making decisions. It's not. It's some sort of complicated, statistically based algorithm that's aggregating verbal data for you. That's all it's doing. There's no there that's doing something, which is precisely the problem, right? Grok isn't responsible because Grok is not a moral agent.
Right.
Grok is a machine whose operations we don't understand. Even the people who designed and built this machinery don't understand it, which is a rather astonishing technology when you stop and think about it. I can't think of anything else that we've made that's analogous to that.
Well, and it's frustrating too, because on one hand, yes, we know that they're getting better, and that's always the answer. Oh, yeah, it's early days, it gets better. But let's say that the lies move from half hallucinations, they call them. I don't know why.
It's a great word, right? Oh, the machine is psychotic now. Oh, okay. Let's give it some risperidone, and then it won't hallucinate for us anymore.
Yeah, well, it's not lying; it's just hallucinating. Right. So let's say it only hallucinates half the time. It's like, no, that gets better. See, now it's only 30% of the time. Now it's only 10% of the time. Now it's only 5% of the time. The problem is with any particular piece of data, you don't know which
category it's in. Yeah, sure.
It only lies to you 1 out of 100 times, but you don't know which of the 100 times.
So when we outsource, let's say, censorship on social media to, rather than to a government agency that you can drag before a court of law, or a person working for that agency that you can depose in a legal case, what happens when we outsource that censorship to AI, to something that cannot and will never be held responsible, and is making decisions in that regard that its designers do not understand?
Yeah. Well, this is why it's so important that you did all this litigation with Missouri Biden and whatever it was before, Murphy, Missouri or something, which was recently settled. And I've kvetched a little bit. Initially, when I saw the settlement, I thought, well, that's not really a settlement. You convinced me that, it was actually, by modern standards, by any standards you might expect today, pretty good. In the sense that there was kind of a admission of wrongdoing. There's an admission of the facts that fell to the plaintiffs, right? And a restriction on certain social media companies for a period of 10 years, which is weird. Why 10 years? But okay. And then, it was frustrating that it only covered the plaintiffs, but symbolically it covers a larger principle, namely the spirit,
correct,
if not the letter, of the First Amendment. But so I know you spent what, 5 years on the? No, 4 years. How long have you been on this?
It's 2022. So 4 years on this case.
But how much time?
A lot of money from
a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of reading documents, a lot of phone time burned up, right?
Yep.
You didn't get paid for this?
I did not. And, the government, as part of the settlement, has to compensate our lawyers for their time, but not the plaintiffs. So this is not why we did it. We did not expect to get monetary damages from this case. What we wanted was to set a legal precedent in federal court that would make it easier for ordinary Americans to put a stop to this sort of thing. And it did that, even if the decision was not as broad and robust as we might have wanted. It was a win. We can put to rest the critics who were saying, oh, the Supreme Court tossed this out, which was not true. They remanded it back to a lower court, and they dismissed a preliminary injunction on a technicality. They did not rule on the merits of the case. The only ruling we have had on the merits of the case has been in the favor of the plaintiffs, including the final settlement, which, again, even if the win was not as robust as we might not have wanted, the win was definitely in favor of the plaintiffs. The critics cannot argue any longer that the court in our case said that this was not happening, or what the plaintiffs were saying was not true. It's very clear that there was an admission of guilt on the part of the government for having done this.
You and I were at the Supreme Court on the day this was you had appealed the. Let me get this straight. The defendants had appealed the injunction to the Supreme Court,
right, and
had asked for a stay. Am I getting this right?
Yes.
And the Supreme Court granted a stay of the injunction.
Correct.
But sent it back to the court.
The district court for the case as a whole, the trial phase of the case. The preliminary injunction was one aspect of the case, that the only aspect of the case that the court was ruling on. And by the way, a preliminary injunction is very hard to get.
Yeah.
There's a very, very high legal threshold for that. So the fact that the Supreme Court didn't uphold the preliminary injunction was disappointing. I think the decision was wrong for reasons that we can go into if we want to sort of rehearse that history. Yeah. But even so, be that as it may, it's really hard to get a preliminary injunction. You have to show even before you go to the fact-finding trial stage that already on early discovery, limited discovery, you've got enough information to suggest that the plaintiffs are going to prevail. And therefore, the court needs to step in right away and not wait till the end of the case in order to put a stop to it.
It turns out that the judge in that case was correct. You did prevail. So
we did. That's right.
Yeah. And it seemed like reading that early preliminary injunction, the judge was tremendously alarmed. I mean, he said, this is an outrage. This is
Terry Doughty, the Western District of Louisiana, said that if what plaintiffs say is true, and by granting the injunction, he indicated it looks like it's probably true, this is the worst free speech violation in United States history. That was not me or one of the other plaintiffs. That was not one of our lawyers. That was a federal judge who had looked at all the evidence we had submitted, came to that conclusion, issued an injunction on the 4th of July on a federal holiday, I think deliberately to drive home the point that this is a core First Amendment case, is a very serious violation of that. And the reason it's a serious violation is the first case of its kind of the digital age, which is another reason it was important to get a favorable ruling that could at least be precedent setting, because the Fifth Circuit, when they heard the appeal on that injunction, pointed out that there's no previous Supreme Court or other federal court cases that can serve as an adequate precedent for this case. So the precedent they cited was a case from the 1970s of a book publisher. Had nothing to do with social media, the government pressuring one book publisher on one book. What was novel about our case, Jeffrey, was because of this new digital technology and the fact that so many Americans are sharing speech and speaking on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, so forth. When the government pressured social media companies not only to remove individual accounts or to remove individual posts that the government had flagged that they didn't like, but they would pressure them to change their algorithms. And in some cases, the social media companies caved in on that. Once they changed those algorithms, that impacted, by our estimates, tens of thousands of posts, tens of thousands of accounts, hundreds of thousands of times. So hundreds of thousands of cases of government-sponsored censorship just vastly overshadowed anything that had ever come before the courts in terms of the reach and the scope and the nature of the censorship, precisely because this was the first case of the digital age when we had this powerful technology that if the government could gain control over it, which they did for a period of time, gain control over the companies that had control over it, they could censor on a scale that had never been seen before.
So, and I pointed this out in my little speech in front of the Supreme Court that day, that I'm not sure if I made the point clearly, but censorship in the past has never really had to target citizens as such. It's not really been the issue. The issue was targeting the venue through which
Correct.
Citizens were speaking. So in the Civil War, they would shut down, the newspapers. This happened in World War I, too, that you would shut down the newspaper editors. And this has always been, and then it was like radio and then television. But with the internet and social media, suddenly, every citizen becomes basically a newspaper editor, right? So then it became deeply personal.
Yeah.
And reach into everybody's lives, and people experience this. You would join a Facebook group about the vaccine injured, and suddenly it was just obliterated.
100,000 people in a Facebook group. Suddenly it disappears.
Yeah, and they took down, I think, did I hear at some point like millions of? Is that right? Millions of videos, YouTube.
I don't know the number on YouTube. I mean, YouTube. My first instance of known censorship was on YouTube. It was an interview I did right after I filed my lawsuit against the University of California, challenging their vaccine mandate, just before I got fired in retaliation for having done that. Did an interview with a woman named Allison Morrow, formerly at CBS News, and had left, was working for the state of Washington, and had a podcast on the side. So she posted this interview, wasn't even talking about vaccine safety and efficacy, just the ethics and the legal issues around vaccine mandates, which I was an expert on. I was the director of the medical ethics program at University of California, Irvine, chairman of the ethics committee at the California Department of State Hospitals. I was qualified to talk on medical ethics. YouTube took down that video, suspended her account. I was fired shortly thereafter. Her employer then approached her and said, if you do not take the interview with Kheriaty down off the other platforms where it's still up, it was not on YouTube, but it was on other platforms. If you don't take it down off those as well, we're going to fire you. She didn't take it down, and they ended up firing her. So within a couple of weeks, I was censored, she was censored, I was fired, she was fired for having a conversation online that we shared with other people. And so it was surreal. It was surreal. And state-sponsored censorship, in her case, the state of Washington, in my case, the federal government, pressuring YouTube and other social media companies to take action like that. That was the overt form of censorship. The subtle form of censorship, which was much more insidious and much more powerful, was when you're censored and you don't even realize that you're being censored. So for a while, people were insisting I'm being shadow banned, let's say on Twitter. What is shadow banning? Shadow banning is I put something out there and it looks like I posted it, and maybe some of my followers can see it, but many people are reaching out to me saying, oh, that post that you said you posted when we talked on the phone, I'm not seeing it in my feed. I just can't find it, right? Well, Elon Musk confirmed, including in a personal conversation I had with him, that yes, this is exactly how the algorithm worked, and it did that. Why is it so insidious? Well, let's say I put something out there on Twitter, a new piece of data about some scientific issue, whatever. Let's say 85, 90% of my followers see it in their feed. That sounds pretty good until you realize that the algorithm has flagged that, and that 10, 15% that we're not allowed to see it are precisely the ones that themselves have the largest following on Twitter or X, who, if they were to repost it, would allow something like that to spread and go viral beyond a narrow corner of, the group that happens to see it. And just by tweaking things in that way, you can prevent certain ideas from taking hold and spreading. You can also, by the way, using that same technology, artificially boost ideas that are not organically going viral that you want more eyeballs on, which is happening as well. So you and I are, our friend Walter Kern, I think, had the best metaphor for this. He's followed this issue very closely. And as a novelist, Walter is very good with metaphors. He said, This kind of control is like an engineer at a soundboard mixing a record, right? So using complex AI to scrape the internet and see what ideas are taking hold and influencing people, and what ideas maybe are not doing that we might want to be doing that. And it's like, okay, well, I'm looking over here and I don't like this thing over here. There's too much snare drum. So I'm just going to turn the volume down on the snare drum, just tinker with the algorithm a little bit. And over here, this idea that I really like, nobody's latching onto. We got to have more cowbell. So I'm just going to turn the volume up on the cowbell, down and less snare, and literally controlling how people think by controlling what information they have access to. That's subtle, that is insidious, but it's more powerful than YouTube came down and boom, I know what happened. I can tell the story. I can complain about it, whatever.
Aaron, and part of it comes down to you're toying with people's expectations concerning how many people they should normally or would otherwise normally reach. So if you degrade that enough, after a while you think, well, I don't have a big account. People don't like me.
Exactly.
So
no one's listening to what I have to say. It doesn't seem to be like getting any traction. Whereas if it was a level playing field,
right.
You might have hundreds of thousands of followers and be an influencer for all you know.
So I didn't know this until March 2020 when I had been spent a whole career, following the data and understanding the relationship between websites and social media, tracking very carefully how many people are reading the article at one time, how many total reads it gets. And like I had a model in my mind about the way things should work. But in the third and fourth week of March 2020, Facebook now had a new little scam going. I'm not sure when they put it in, probably since 2016. It was called the fact checking, right? So they assign fact checkers to basically, put down things they don't like and then approve things they do like. And I wrote this article called Woodstock Occurred in the Middle of a Pandemic, right? So that was like the third week of March 2020. And the Facebook fact checkers fact checked it as true. And so that sent a message to, and the algorithms weren't that sophisticated at the time. So that sent a message to Facebook, amplify this. And in the course of like 48 hours, I saw that there had been something like 3 million views on this one article. I've never in my entire life seen anything like that. Like I had no idea of the power of Facebook to generate views. And it really, really matters whether you get 300 or 3 million views. This is massive. Well, suffice it to say they figured this out, that somebody figured out this is a mistake and turn it off again. So next thing you know, nobody's reading my article. Yeah. So that was a weird experience for me because I suddenly realized, I'm naive. I think I'm writing an article, and if people read it, I think they like me. If they don't read it, I think, I guess that wasn't very good. This is extremely naive. Yeah. It turns out that.
And if you use these platforms enough, you can get a feel for what's happening to you, to your account. This how this invisible machinery is. So I'm on X less than I used to be, but in the thick of COVID, I was posting a lot, and I could tell when I would hit a 2-week roadblock where it didn't matter what I posted, it was going to get a trickle because something had been flagged. I was never kicked off. I was careful about my language. You have to sort of speak in code sometimes on certain issues. But you could still feel yourself getting throttled here and there. You could feel when it turned on, you could feel when it turned off. And again, circling back to the beginning of our conversation, okay, if there's a problem with these algorithms and they're not conducive either to a level playing field or to the promotion of free and civil debate or truthful ideas or whatever, how do you fix that? If you were to go to Elon Musk and complain, hey, the algorithm on X is messed up, We got to fix it. Let's say he wanted to. The algorithm does not exist in one place. It now exists in 4,000 different laptops, all chopped up into 4,000 different pieces, because these things are outsourced to independent contractors who get one small piece of your job is to tinker with this aspect of
it took
the
Elon,
Twitter algorithm. And so it's not even a unitary program that you could go in and sort of overhaul, even if you wanted to.
And then you have, in addition to that, so your lawsuit had focused very carefully on the ways in which government is pressuring social media companies, either directly or through third-party NGOs and academic institutions and fact checkers and news guards or whatever. That no matter how you do it, you can't launder your censorship, right? I mean, through these third parties. So you guys were successful at that. But there's another weird problem, is that during this, tell me what you think about this. There's an ideological, cultural issue roiling within the corporate world generally, that leans against many of the things that you and I believe in, right? The COVID period seemed to not just train the algorithms, but it trained the companies themselves and the culture of these companies into the kinds of ideas that ruling class elites like, and the kinds of ideas that they don't like. So you can even unplug the influence of government and all these kind of things, and you very well might get like the same results anyway, just by virtue of the way they are habitually privileging some ideas and deprecating others.
I think that's exactly right. And just to clarify for our listeners, all the defendants in our case were government officials and government agencies. Our case was not going after Twitter, Facebook. It was not going after the platforms themselves, but just the government. Because we can argue about whether the platform should or shouldn't be able to censor, how to interpret the laws that govern them in that regard, which is Section 230 of the Communications Act. That's a legal debate. But no one can debate that the government can't censor people. So that's who we went after in our case. But let's say we haven't yet, but let's say we could theoretically solve the issue of government meddling. Our case put a dent in it. I don't think it resolved it by any stretch of the imagination, but even if we could resolve it, we still have the problem of the platforms themselves. And I think that goes back to a bad piece of legislation, or at least how we've interpreted a piece of legislation. There's debates about whether it's being applied correctly. But Section 230 basically creates a situation in which social media companies can have their cake and eat it too in ways that are fundamentally wrong-headed. Let me explain what I mean by that. So Section 230 immunizes social media companies against liability for the content that's on their platform. So if I try to publish in the New York Times, the New York Times has total editorial control. They can publish my op-ed or my letter to the editor. And that's, if they say, no, we're not going to publish your opinion piece, Kheriaty, that's not censorship. That's them exercising editorial control because they're a publisher, right? They're not required to print anything and everything that someone submits to them. But as a consequence of that, they are responsible for the stuff that they do print. So if I publish something in the New York Times that is libelous, not only can I get sued for that, but the New York Times could get sued for publishing that and for not fact checking it, right? And so they're responsible for that. We protected the social media companies from that kind of liability. And Mark Zuckerberg said, if you take away that liability protection, that's an existential threat to our business model, right? They obviously couldn't survive without that, I think, for reasons that should be clear to everyone. There's no way to manage every single post on Twitter and fact check it. The company couldn't do that. Fine. But if that's the case, then they are not publishers, which means they should not have editorial control, which means they should not have the ability to censor, right? You can't have it both ways. Either you're a publisher like the New York Times, you're responsible for everything you publish, and you can say yes or no, we're gonna allow you to post this, or we're not gonna allow you to post this, or you're what's called a common carrier. An example of a common carrier is your telephone line, right? The telephone company cannot control the information that goes through the telephone line, and they're not responsible for it either. They're just a conduit of information, right? So if I call up my buddy who's a criminal and we coordinate how we're going to break in and steal something, right? AT&T, or the phone line I use, is not responsible for that, and they're not required to monitor that to make sure that, you know, we're using their phone line responsibly. Fine, they're a common carrier. My view is that the social media companies should be that. The Supreme Court has defined a very small, very narrow category of things that are not constitutionally protected speech. Child pornography is the first example people always come up with. You know, when you're challenging censorship, well, what about child porn? Child porn is not constitutionally protected speech. It's criminal. The government can censor that, right? A direct incitement to physical violence is criminal speech. It's not constitutionally protected. Those are the big examples. Certain forms of obscenity and certain promotion of illegal activities. And I always have to qualify direct incitement to physical violence. We've got this new rhetoric that, you know, language is violence and words are violence. No, violence is violence. So that's often used as a pretext or a predicate for censorship. But no, direct incitement to physical violence, child pornography, other forms of illegal speech, which there aren't very many of, the social media companies can take that down. Otherwise, they got to allow everything, right? That's my view. That's probably going to require new legislation, but that would be a solve. Well, then I don't want anything and everything coming through my social media feed. There's going to be a lot of offensive stuff that I don't want to see on Twitter. Fine, but put the control and the filters in the hands of the users, right? So you can click on a button that says, I want the Brownstone Institute filter on my X account, or I want the CNN or MS Now or Fox News filter. I want to tinker with the settings and make my own filters so that I can, you know, get the stuff that I want. Put that in the hands of the user, not in the hands of this invisible machinery, either people at the corporation or now AI or complex algorithms that nobody understands that's controlling that flow of information. Level the playing field and allow the public debate to happen, allow the users to curate and cultivate the information that they want to see.
Which seems to be more or less how X works, but that doesn't preclude terms of service, right? That are very very clear, right?
Right. I'm not sure X has moved very far in that direction since Elon Musk took over. I don't think they're perfect in that regard, but they've certainly improved in that regard. But I mean, I think that should be the standard for all social media companies. If your speech is not criminal, these things are common carriers, and you should be allowed to post it.
That makes sense. If they're going to enjoy that 230 protection, I don't know what your sense of it is. Sometimes I feel it's like, okay, let me just caution here. So we have your settlement, but there have been two more. One that was announced just most recently by CHD. Do you want to just mention the other two settlements? Go ahead.
So there was Kennedy v. Biden, which was basically what happened in Missouri v. Biden is on our documents on discovery, it became clear that one of the people that was being targeted for censorship by the government was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So RFK Jr., along with CHD, which at the time was his nonprofit, filed a case in the same district court in Louisiana called Kennedy v. Biden. And the judge consolidated our two cases for purposes of discovery, meaning stuff that we got on discovery, Kennedy could use as part of his evidence and vice versa. The two cases came to different settlement agreements. And had they continued on into trial, the judge could have made a different ruling for one case versus the other case, depending on the facts of the case. But for purposes of discovery, they were combined. And my understanding from Mary Holland at CHD is they came to a settlement agreement recently. I think the terms of that agreement are less public than the Missouri v. Biden because we had a public consent decree that you could read online, whereas they did not. But my impression was they got something analogous to what we got. And then in our case, we were represented by a nonprofit called NCLA, the New Civil Liberties Alliance. And NCLA recently announced another victory in another free speech case that they were working on. And because I'm not totally familiar with all the details of that case, I don't want to say too much about it, but it seemed like another significant win, having to do with batting down some of these third-party fact checkers. Jeffrey, I haven't dug into that case in detail, but that was my impression.
Yeah, that was going after NewsGuard, and I was so grateful for that, because I don't know if you ever dealt with NewsGuard, but as a publisher, it was just unbearable. Like, I had barely opened up Brownstone, and NewsGuard is sending me emails demanding interviews, and they were going to rate us. They're going to try to figure us out, and then
it's like a mafia shakedown, right? Yeah. You move into the neighborhood, and the mob boss sends somebody to your office to come.
And I didn't know initially what to think about this, but they would send me these long notes taking apart a single article, going, well, you claim this, but other people say this. You claim this, other people say that. Are you going to correct this error? Can you talk to it? And I take it seriously and spend some time with it and think, well, I don't know this. Yes, other people say other things, but, I can say different things, and, we're working from same or different set of facts, but there's nothing wrong. So, but I used to respond to them. And then finally I just called the guy up. And first of all, I looked up who he was. It turned out, he had long history in, sort of partisan, left-wing politics, whatever. And so I got so frustrated with him. I remember I was walking in the park one day, talking on the phone. I just started yelling at him. So be like, look, I know exactly who you are and exactly what you're up to, and you're not going to censor us. And I know what you're doing, and I think you're a scam and a racket. And it's too bad you don't have you should get a life and stop working for the scam artists that you're working for. I was really started yelling at him, but that didn't shut him up. They kept pounding us with interrogations for 2 years afterwards. And after a while, I just started deleting them. I thought, this is just dumb. Yeah. Why should I care what this organization called NewsGuard? So the new NCLA settlement has, I think, the Justice Department saying, yeah, you're right. NewsGuard was a scam, and it was kind of a third-party censor. One of the things, Aaron, that frustrated me about, and you said you didn't really want to visit this history, but one piece of it I do want to revisit with you. You and I were at Supreme Court on the same day, and the argumentation and the sort of back and forth with the justices that day didn't seem to ever really kind of drill down into the essence of what was at issue.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure that the 9 justices, clearly Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito, who wrote the excellent dissenting opinion, understood the issue. I'm not sure the other 6 grasped exactly what was going on. One of my regrets about what happened, and it happened for purely political reasons in the Attorney General's office in Missouri at the time, that the legal mastermind of our case, and John Vecchione and others at NCLA have done tremendous work on our case. But the guy who built it originally was John Sauer, who's a name that may be familiar to some of our listeners, because at the time he was the Solicitor General at the state of Missouri. John was a friend of mine. He called me and asked me if I had ever been censored. And I said, yeah. I told him the story about Allison Morrow and some other instances. And he said, well, we're filing this lawsuit with Louisiana and with our state against the federal government, and we need some private plaintiffs. Do you know any other credible doctors and scientists that have been censored? I said, you got to call Jay Bhattacharya. You got to call Martin Kulldorff. So those guys got attached. Jill Hines, of course, health freedom advocate from Louisiana, and Jim Hoft, another journalist, the Gateway Pundit, also became attached. Martin and Jay, now working for the defendants, have recused themselves as plaintiffs because they're now, at NIH and HHS. But John was the mastermind, and John is a brilliant litigator. Matt Taibbi wrote a terrific piece about his oral arguments down at the district court when we got the injunction. And he's one of these guys that, the justices ask him a question. He said, off the top of his head, well, I refer you to footnote 46 on page 297 of the second.
I heard him do that today in the Supreme Court.
Most people that can do that don't have the rhetorical skills, let's say, because their brains are different. They might exist somewhere on the savant autistic spectrum, but John has the rhetorical skills. He's got both, which is an extraordinarily rare combination to be able to do that. And so he knew the case cold, and unfortunately, he, for various reasons that I won't get into, he couldn't do the oral arguments at our case. And I always wonder, might we not have gotten one or two of the other justices, maybe that 5-justice majority we needed to uphold the preliminary injunction, had John argued the case and answered their questions and been able to really lay out for them what was going on.
To say anything against the attorney who argued the case.
No. I don't want to criticize him. He was doing the best he could, but he just hadn't been involved in the case until right before the Supreme Court. He was a young guy at the Louisiana AG's office. So this is not to disparage him, but when you've been in the thick of something for months and months, when you've done the research, John did all the depositions himself, at cold, you're in a different position than a guy they tap at the last second who's trying to cram and get ready. So all that to say, it's I hesitate to say this publicly because it's going to sound like I'm criticizing the person who did the oral arguments. And I honestly think he did the best he could, but we didn't have our ace that day.
Yeah, I knew things when I knew things for sure that the message wasn't getting across. And by the way, this isn't so easy to explain. It's a little bit complicated. But when the Chief Justice Roberts said, "You're telling me that if I'm an official in government, I can't call up the New York Times and complain about what they write about," and this was not at all.
No, here's the answer that should have been given to that question, because he and Kavanaugh were both White House attorneys who had done this before. That's why they asked the question. And the answer to that question is, when you call up the New York Times, you're talking to an editor who is the person that you are censoring, right? And you're pressuring the person that you are censoring. And that person can tell you to go pound sand. They can even print something on the front page of the New York Times the next day saying, hey, that story that I ran yesterday, the White House called and tried to coerce me to take it down, right? I mean, they can punch back, right? Also, the government does not have the ability to threaten the New York Times with things that would be an existential threat to their business model the way they did to the social media companies. So they're not talking to the person who's being censored. The person who's being censored doesn't know that they're being censored. They're talking to someone else who's not on the receiving end of that censorship. So it's a totally different dynamic. And we know that the government did threaten to remove Section 230 liability protections, which again would have been an existential threat to their business model. They can't do that to the New York Times. If they tried to do that to the New York Times would go after them on the front page of the newspaper every day until they stopped, right? They would be able to punch back. So that question wasn't really, that question was a sincere, honest question, but demonstrated that the justices, even some of the conservative justices, did not grasp the nature of the censorship in this new digital environment and the ways in which it was not at all analogous to what you might have been dealing with in the past.
Right. Oh, you just reminded me about this weird scene. I remember at some point in the Biden presidency, he was asked about, they were trying to drum up more vaccinations. They used every method you could possibly think of, but at some point he yelled at a reporter, it was on the White House lawn or something, that Facebook is killing people.
Yeah.
by permitting too much free speech. Yeah.
Well, Facebook responded to that, unfortunately, by complying with the censorship. One of the things, though, that surprised us, Jeffrey, we thought maybe it's going to be hard to prove pressure, coercion, intimidation, because, as you mentioned earlier, maybe their ideological interests just would happen to align. The companies and the government are going to look totally hand in glove, cooperative, not coercive. What we found in the documents on discovery and a lot of the communications was, no, actually, the social media companies pushed back. They wanted the government off their back, and the government commenced a relentless beatdown in order to pressure them into submission. So Janine Eunice, who formerly at NCLA, one of the lawyers on the case for a while, she and I co-authored a piece in the Wall Street Journal called The White House COVID Censorship Machine, where we documented back and forth between a Facebook executive and a man named Rob Flaherty at the White House, where it was exactly this that was happening. You know, he's throwing a tirade. He's literally dropping F-bombs, saying somebody very, very high up in my office is really upset with you. And when you say that and you work for the White House, people know who you're talking about. So the social media companies wanted the government off their back, but the government is so powerful in terms of their interests that eventually I think they felt that they had to comply. One of the ways that our case, I think, did succeed, or at least help in the success, was I said from the beginning, we have to fight in the court of law. We have to also fight in the court of public opinion. So while the case is going on, you know, we're publishing in Wall Street Journal, Brownstone, Tablet Magazine, other free press, other venues. This is what we're finding in our case. We're informing the American people of what we're learning, the nature of the censorship industrial complex. So that, and combined with the Twitter files that were coming out pretty much simultaneously with what we were discovering on our case, those things became mutually reinforcing. We learned from one another, like where to look and what to look for. Those things put this issue on the map, made it an issue in the 2020 election, made it an issue in the presidential debate. The very last question put to J.D. Vance in the VP debate, which is the last debate before the election. Don't you think that your running mate is a threat to democracy? His response was, I think the real threat to democracy is the government-sponsored censorship that's been happening at an industrial scale for the last several years. Right? So it was an issue. Executive order on day one, where Trump vowed to dismantle the censorship machinery on the government side. I think that would not have happened without Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and opening backdoor communication channels to some independent journalists like Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, and others. Our friend Andrew Lowenthal, who worked on the Twitter files, and the Missouri v. Biden case shining a bright light on what was going on. So there's value in fighting these battles in the legal realm, even if you don't get a favorable opinion in the end, even if you get a lukewarm opinion that's not as favorable as you wanted. The whole process of legal fact-finding and discovery, the subpoenas of otherwise classified documents or documents you would have no access to, being able to depose people for 8 hours at a stretch under threat of penalty of perjury to get information from them. That, you know, people behave differently when they know they're being scrutinized, right? It. And so the threat of legal action, actually taking legal action, will have an effect on the behavior of the people on the receiving end of that. So, you know, we got to think about these strategies with a kind of big picture in mind, and understand that while the final ruling in a case obviously is important, it's not the only reason to engage in a legal fight.
Yeah, and the First Amendment is a beautiful, wonderful, inspiring thing. I think we're the only country that has, you know, a really decisive parchment-based founding document that says free speech is a right, and that must account in part for why we seem to have better conditions of speaking than any Commonwealth countries or any country in Europe. But the thing doesn't enforce itself, does it? It requires people to stick their necks out. You did that, and it's taking you 4 years, and a lot of hard work from a lot of attorneys. There's very low pay. obviously no pay in your case, but it's a great example of what it's taken for the last 6 years, really, to resist the kind of despotism we've experienced. It just takes people to stick their necks out. So we're very grateful to you, Aaron.
We have to do it. I mean, if you look at the history of free speech in the United States, it was a fight from the beginning, starting with the second administration and John Adams trying to go after critics of our foreign policy. The ink was barely dry on the First Amendment when we had to start fighting for it in the courts. And it's been a fight ever since. And it's going to continue to be a fight because of that constant temptation for those in power to want to shut other people up.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
All the best.